Uh, awesome. Thanks, Rach. Cool. All right. So welcome to the Test Prep and Digital SAT webinar. We'll introduce ourselves shortly, but first a little bit of housekeeping. We will be taking some time for questions at the end, and thanks to everyone who sent in questions in advance. We incorporated as many as we could into the presentation in advance. But if you have questions that are coming up, please use the Q&A feature, and we will plan to answer those at the end. And with that, let's kick it off. All right, so I'm Emily LeBaco. I'm the Director of Test Prep and Tutoring Curriculum at Private Prep. I work a lot on the ACT and SAT, as well as some other admissions exams, as well as tutoring. And I also work as a tutor myself. So I am very excited to be talking a lot more today about the testing landscape and the upcoming digital SAT.
Great, and I'm Rachel Elmer. I'm the Director of the College Admissions Team at Private Prep. So my job and my team's job is to work with students on the, so what do I do with this test now that I have taken it, part of the equation. We're going to let Emily lead the conversation tonight because I know a lot of you, most of you have sophomores or younger, and there are a lot of questions around the shifting landscape with what the test will even be with the digital SAT. And then after Emily's spoken, I'll jump in with talking a bit more about the context and why and if that matters.
Thanks, Rach. All right, cool. So let's kick it off here. First, just a little bit here about Private Prep for anybody who has not worked with us before. Private Prep is an education services company, and we really are committed to a team feel to help unlock student potential. So we work on test prep, subject tutoring, college admissions, and other academic skills coaching. And we really try to personalize our approach here to find the right fit between the student and tutor. And we do work in online and in person in multiple markets. So as Rachel said, today we'll start with some test prep highlights, where we are now, and then we'll get into the upcoming changes to the SAT that I know are really kind of the buzz, and we'll wrap it up with the college admissions landscape and some Q&A. So we did want to start off with some kind of basics of test prep. Our audience here is mainly freshmen and sophomores and their parents. If you have a child who's a junior, this is partially still relevant in the beginning, so feel free to hang out. But most of what we'll be talking today will be geared toward freshmen and sophomores. But just some background on the ACT and the SAT. All colleges accept both the ACT and the SAT. This is a question that we get on occasion. Is one looked at more highly than the other? That is not the case in our current landscape. So both schools, or all schools, are going to look at both tests, including the current SAT and the digital SAT that we'll be getting into shortly. So in part of our process, we want students to take diagnostic exams, test out an ACT, test out an SAT, find which one fits their strengths better, and stick with that test. Students generally take 2 to 3 tests over the course of junior year. And these tests really have a wide range of content. And that's why we encourage students to wait until junior year, as most of what is on the test is going to be things that they're tested up through the end of sophomore year into the beginning of junior year. And juniors and sophomores have an opportunity to take full-length ACT and SAT diagnostic tests with Private Prep to determine which one's a better fit for them. Really, the key here is full length. These tests are long. The digital SAT is getting shorter, but sitting for a standardized test is an experience that students need to gain. Taking full-length practice tests to start off the process really allows students to get a feel for the tests and which one they'll be stronger in. Okay, so the changes to the SAT. So, we've had many years of practice. We're used to the ACT. We're used to the paper SAT in its format. And the SAT is now going to change on us. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this new digital SAT will be different, as this change is going to affect sophomores and freshmen. So first of all, many things are going to stay the same about the new SAT, which I think is a little bit comforting anytime that there's a big change like this. The content of the SAT, as well as the PSAT, is going to stay largely the same. It's tied to knowledge and skills that students learn in high school. That is not something that's going to be changing. The score is also not going to change. Students are still going to receive a score out of 1,600. They'll get a score out of 800 for the verbal side, a score out of 800 for the math side. That's going to be the same on this new test. Students will continue to test in schools and test centers as they do now. That means taking a device or having a device that will be sent to the school, but it will still take place in classrooms or other rooms in schools and test centers. This is not going to be an online at-home exam, at least at this point. And students who have accommodations, 50% and 100% extended time are some of the most common ones, will receive them on the new digital SAT. As well as a slew of other accommodations. From what we know so far, the College Board is really looking to do as many accommodations as possible in the new digital testing format, although it does sound like there will still be an option for paper testing for students who have an accommodation that they cannot take a digital test. But lots of things are new and different with this digital SAT, and some of these things are very exciting for students. Certainly the fact that the exam is shorter. So this test is going to be just about 2 hours, a little over. Currently, the exam is over 3 hours. So we know that students are going to be excited to take the test in a lesser amount of time, probably something that will feel a little bit more manageable. Students are also going to have more time per question on the digital SAT. So the pace will feel a little bit slower. Taking a standardized test like the SAT can be stressful. So for a student to have more time per question is really exciting. Reading passages are currently about a page of reading right now, about 80 to 90 lines of text. That is going to change pretty drastically on this new SAT. Reading passages are going to be shorter. They're about 3 to 5 sentences on average, and they will be tied to a single question. Whereas on the current paper SAT, students answer 10 to 11 questions about a single passage. So this is a big change. And again, I think many students will find that it feels a little bit more manageable. And finally, calculators will also be allowed on all sections of the digital SAT. The current SAT has one no calculator and one calculator section. That's going away. And actually, in addition to using a graphing calculator, bringing one that students are used to from class, the test app actually has its own built-in calculator from Desmos. So this is an exciting change for students. A few things that are new and different. Scores are only going to take a few days to come back. This is also exciting, maybe exciting for students when they're thinking about the admission side of things as well when we get closer to the fall of their senior year. Students will get their scores in a few days. It's not going to take over a week, 10 plus days for scores to come back, which is great. And then some technicalities here. Students can bring their own device to the testing center. They can bring a laptop or a tablet. That includes Chromebooks, that includes iPads, and students will be able to take the exam on that device. Or they will be able to use a school-issued device. For example, schools maybe have Chromebooks for their students. Or if a student doesn't have access to a reliable device, they can apply to get a device provided by the College Board for test day. The big change, and I think this is really the one that is the most new, but also potentially can cause a little bit of stress, is that this new digital SAT is going to be adaptive. So this is something that is new to the SAT for sure. It's not necessarily new though to testing. So if some people have taken grad level exams, things like the GMAT, those tests are already adaptive, and this has been done for decades. But it is new to us on the SAT. What that means is that a student will take an initial section. So for example, they'll start with a verbal module, and then their performance on that first module determines the difficulty level of the second module, and therefore the score that they will be able to reach on that section. So I will talk some more about adaptive testing, but this is really probably the biggest change that families and us at private prep will have to adjust to. So a little bit more about this adaptive test scoring. So for each of the two sections, we have a verbal section and a math section on the digital SAT. Students will first see a module 1 that is sort of a standard middle difficulty section. Then that score on that first section is used to determine the difficulty level that students will see on module 2. So students will take verbal module 1, and then they will either get a higher or lower difficulty level verbal module 2. In order to earn a top score, and I think what makes this tricky is a student needs to do well enough on the first module to be able to get the higher difficulty section if they want a shot at an 800, or if they want a shot at a top score. There are a lot of nuances to this, so there isn't a specific cut score, but below a certain level, below a certain threshold, students will get that lower difficulty, and then they won't be able to get a top score. And probably that's going to mean a score 650, 700 and above will be something that even if a student has a perfect accuracy on that second module, they will not be able to get to a top score of 700 or 800. Awesome. So the test structure itself, the digital SAT, as I've said, is going to have these 4 modules. And here's just a quick rundown of what that looks like. Each verbal module has 27 questions that students will have 32 minutes to complete. And then students will take a break of 10 minutes between the verbal and the math modules. And then the math modules are actually even a little bit shorter in terms of questions, 22 math questions per module, 35 minutes to complete those. And again, students will see a different module 2 of higher or lower difficulty, depending on how they complete that first module. Cool. And then a quick overview. So we actually have seen what these tests are going to look like, which is really exciting in terms of students being able to feel prepared. This is a screenshot of a SAT Blue Book app. And this is actually the platform that students will test in. And students will even actually take AP exams if they're taking digital AP exams in this app. It's something that students are going to start to be more familiar with in the coming years. So students will have some features on here that I'm just going to quickly run through. So there's a timer, which is really nice. Gone will be the days of a proctor using a whiteboard to write a time down, and sometimes us having to stress about whether or not they did it correctly and are they doing the math. The timer will be built in. Students can even hide this timer for a portion of the time if they are, feel stressful to have this time ticking down. Until the last 5 minutes of the module, when the timer will reappear, give students a 5-minute warning. And then when they get to 0, the module ends regardless of where the student is, and they're not able to go back and make any changes. Here's an example of the calculator that I mentioned. We're very excited about this. It's the Desmos calculator. Some students are going to be familiar with this already from math class. I know some of my students, if they forget their graphing calculator for homework, will bring out this Desmos calculator, but it's a really powerful tool. So this is something that students will be able to click into right in the testing app and use this graphing calculator for really any calculations that they need to complete. The digital SAT will also have a reference sheet. This is actually the exact same reference sheet that we see on the paper exam. Nice feature though is, again, you can click to open it and close it. So students can pull this up when they need it. As it is in its current form, these are not actually the most useful skills that are on the test. They do come up occasionally. It's nice to have this reference sheet, but it's probably not going to be something that makes or breaks a student's progress. Students are also able to navigate through the platform in multiple ways. One of those ways is to flag a question. So in the same way that a student could mark or circle a question to come back to, they're able to do that within each module so that they can flag a question that they want to come back to at the end, make any changes. And students will also be able to see a navigation pane that has all of the different questions that they flagged as they move through the test. Awesome. Okay, so all that information out there, and also now to talk about the fact that we have a little time to absorb this, luckily. So when will the digital SAT be implemented? International students outside of the US, are going to start seeing a digital SAT in a few weeks. The March 2023 SAT, internationally only, will be a digital exam. We are excited about this because this means there is a full year for the College Board to get it right before our students in the US start to get this digital version. So it's not available to US students now. They'll be waiting until March of 2024, but we are looking forward to learning lessons from how this first exam goes internationally. But we are excited about the fact that the PSAT is going to be given digitally in fall of 2023. So this is the next PSAT. Current sophomores will see a digital PSAT as juniors, and this will be at all levels from 8th grade and up. We don't know a lot yet about this PSAT, but we do believe that it's going to be the same length as the current digital SAT. And it's going to give students some nice practice if they're planning to take the digital SAT when it rolls out in the spring of 2024. March 2024 will be when the digital SAT goes live in the US. Although I will say we will probably recommend that students not take that test in March, as there will be some hiccups. Test centers have to learn how to get this right, but beginning in March will be the first opportunity. This also means that the paper SAT ends in December of 2023. It will be a hard stop, paper SAT, December 2023. The next SAT will be digital in March 2024. Awesome. Okay, so with all this, people are also wondering, what does this mean for the ACT? At this point, not much. In the beginning, when we first heard this news, we were wondering if the ACT was going to follow suit and start to offer a digital exam. They had actually planned in 2020 to launch a digital exam. It was scrapped because of the beginning of the pandemic, and it has not come back out. At this point, we think this is now purposeful on the part of the ACT as a way for the test to attract test takers who don't want to take a digital exam. And I think this really works in the favor of students who are unsure about taking a digital test or unsure about the adaptive scoring, for example, in the digital SAT. We believe that at least for the time being, the ACT is going to maintain its status quo. So it's going to be a great option for students who are not interested in taking this new digital SAT. So what does this mean for students? We're thinking here about the classes of 2024, 2025, 2026. The class of 2024, our current juniors, are not affected here. And this is going to be something that rolls out in the spring of their senior year. Testing will be in the rearview mirror. They will be hopefully accepted to colleges and figuring out their plans for after high school. Current juniors do not need to worry about the digital SAT. The class of 2025, our current sophomores, things get a lot more interesting. The timing is a little bit tricky with the new digital SAT rollout. It's going to be in the spring of junior year, which does give these students enough time. If they decide, I just want to take the digital SAT, they can wait. They can test in the spring of their junior year. They'll have tests throughout the spring, in the summer, into the fall of their senior year. But not everyone wants to wait, and some students are going to be ready earlier than that. So we'll have individual guidance for students that we're working with, but there are some different possible paths. One is just to say, I'm taking the ACT. I don't want to have to worry about this digital switch. Maybe a student does better on an ACT diagnostic than an SAT diagnostic. Great. ACT is going to be a great test for them. Some students might want to get a little bit of a head start on the paper SAT. For some students, they might say, I think the paper SAT is going to be the right test for me. I don't want to have to worry about the digital. They can start, getting into the spring of their sophomore year, taking diagnostics, and then they'll have enough opportunities between maybe August and December of 2023 to take the paper SAT and be finished. And then some students might want to do a hybrid of these options. Maybe they take the ACT or they take a paper SAT, the digital SAT rolls out, and they say, you know what, I want to give it one last shot. I'm going to switch it over. I'm going to try the digital SAT. And this also will work well because, as we noted, the content across these tests is going to be really similar. And then finally, our current freshmen, at this point, our advice is to hurry up and wait. There will be a lot of changes that are going to happen before these students reach the end of their sophomore year. So for the class of 2026, don't worry too much about testing. You'll have all of these options when it comes. We'll also know a lot more about the digital SAT. There will be more preparation materials. Current freshmen should really just stay focused on their GPA, extracurriculars, the things that they're doing that are not related to standardized testing. Awesome. Okay, and then a little bit about how to prepare. What we know, so far the College Board has released 4 practice tests in that Blue Book app that I mentioned, which has given us a lot of opportunity to start to dissect those practice tests and figure out how we're going to help students prepare. But those are great resources that students can use when they get ready to prep for the digital SAT. Private Prep is also creating digital practice tests. We have one that we put out there. We're wrapping up our second. We're going to have at least 4 practice tests by the summer, and then we'll be adding more. And as we catch up, that means more resources for students that are preparing. And then just a couple quick hits of what we know about the tests so far from those College Board practice tests. The verbal section contains a mix of reading comprehension and grammar skills. Formerly, those were two separate sections. Now they're all in one verbal module. And like I said, we've seen those shorter passages. The math section is very similar in content and actually in format to the current SAT, so no big changes there. Students are continuing to see student-produced responses that rather than writing them in and bubbling, they'll be typing them in, and then that's mixed in with multiple choice. Awesome. And then here's just a quick snapshot of what the private prep digital platform is going to look like. You can see that it's designed to look very similar to the Blue Book screenshots that I shared. And students moving forward are going to do a lot of their practice in a digital form. We'll have these practice tests in the platform, and then we'll also be starting to shift our curriculum to digital rather than using books as we currently do, to help students prepare for what it feels like to be working on a computer screen, taking notes on scrap paper, and kind of a combination of those to prepare them for the test. And then after that, students will be done. They'll be done with test prep. They'll celebrate their success, and they will move on to thinking about college admission. So I'll leave it to Rachel.
Yay. Well, I will say in my dream world, they're thinking about college admissions before the test too, but that's my plug for starting early. But thank you so much, Emily. And I wanted to take this opportunity first before we dive into getting into the weeds about test optional, just to say that what I hear from a lot of families is the shift to test optional policies has been really confusing. And it can be really confusing because colleges are not necessarily consistent with each other. But I kind of want to reframe this shift to have everyone hold the idea that students have more control over their own testing profiles than they ever have in decades. They have so much choice. They have agency in how they choose to use their testing, where they choose to use their testing. And while that can be a little confusing and overwhelming, it also means that they're more in control of the story they're telling to colleges, and that's a good thing. So keep that in mind as we talk more about how it fits into the admissions process. We get asked a lot, because schools are test optional, does anyone even care about standardized tests anymore? Yes, they do, is the short answer, but how much and for which students is a little more nuanced. And really will depend on the student and the schools to which they are applying. But to understand that, let's think about where testing fits into the broader college application process. So most of the schools that we see our students apply to practice holistic admissions review, meaning that they are evaluating a whole host of factors about an applicant beyond just the quantitative, beyond their grades and scores, into activities, character, their letters of rec, their essays, all those other more nebulous things. That is the overall puzzle that admissions officers are trying to fit together as they build their class. You can go to the next slide, Emily. And testing is really a part of the academic profile. So even when a school practices holistic review, a student's academic performance and their profile is the most important part of the process. A student's transcript is the holy grail of the admissions process. That is the most important document that a student is going to send when they send an application. And understandably so, because that is what reflects 3 or 3.5 years of work across high school. So when we talk about academic profile, we're talking about a student's GPA, their grades, as well as the level of rigor of courses they took and their course selection. So the courses they chose and perhaps how they fit with their intended major and things like that. The testing, if a student submits it or if it's required, supports the transcript. It supports the story that the transcript is telling, but it is always secondary to a student's academic performance. This was true before so many schools were test optional. It has always been the case that a student with an absolutely outstanding transcript in really, really hard courses who had maybe not a perfect score could still get into a really selective school, as opposed to a student who maybe didn't have the same academic performance, but had a 36 or a 1600 on one of those tests. The transcript is always going to win. But the standardized test can be a valuable data point for admissions officers to better understand a student's choices in high school, their upward trajectory across time, their high school context, a number of other factors. And they're trying to use that data point, if it's available, combined with the student's transcript to answer the question, can this student thrive here? Can they do the work here? That's the question they sort of have to check off, say yes, moving on to all the fun, interesting, extracurricular, and other things. And so that's really the role that testing is playing in support of the academic profile. So some key terms, just to make sure we are all on the same page, because sometimes they're used interchangeably when they shouldn't be. So test optional means that a student is welcome to submit a score as a part of their application. If they do not submit a score, they will not be penalized for not submitting it. That is really true. They may imagine that there was a low score, but they're not, writing in a 23 in pencil on the top of the application. They're just evaluating the file without it. But if a student does choose to submit testing, it will become a part of the academic profile. If a school is test blind, or that's also sometimes known as test free, even if a student sends a test, even if they got a perfect score, the college or university will not consider it in the application process. So the University of California system is probably the most noteworthy change there. They no longer review standardized testing as part of the application process. Some parts of Cornell are also test blind. So that's much less common than test optional. This past fall, over 90% of colleges in the United States were test optional, only a handful were test blind. So test optional is definitely the one that you will likely be interacting with the most. Can move to the next. Is that a double? There we go. So leading to the $1 million question. So if I take the test, should I submit it? How do I decide if I submit it? This can become a complicated decision-making framework, but there are a few fundamental things to keep in mind. One, again, the question of how does this score fit with my transcript? Does this score match what my transcript says about me as a student? Or does this score boost my transcript in some way as a student? Or by the same token, does it bring it down a little bit? When you're in the circumstance where it is bringing down the academic profile, that is the student who really might benefit from applying as a test optional applicant. We do see that. We have seen test optional applicants be very successful. I will admit I was the first one to be skeptical when so many schools went test optional as a result of the pandemic, especially of some of the large state schools and their ability to read files that holistically. We have so many students who love places like the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And I was like, can you do it, Michigan? They really have. And we, for example, have students this year who have absolute highest grades, best rigor, and could not connect the dots on testing, who have been admitted to Michigan, who 5 years ago, if they had had to submit that test, it wouldn't have happened for them. So that really does happen. But probably the most of our students are in a place where they either know they're going to submit a test, or they're right on the border for a school's testing range, and they may take a hybrid approach and send that score to some schools and not other schools. And in addition to thinking about how it fits with their own transcript, that's when they start thinking about where does it fit with the reported range at the specific school I am applying to. Backing up a little bit, because I didn't address number 2 here. When does a score really boost a transcript? That can happen, especially for students who might have been on an upward trend during high school, which is not uncommon, especially during the pandemic, when some students might have been transitioning from remote learning to in-person learning again, or had other disruptions. Not everyone knocks it out of the park in 9th grade. That's a normal part of transitioning to high school. And students who have been getting stronger and stronger in their academic performance throughout high school, if they can achieve an SAT or ACT score that really matches with where they are junior year in terms of performance and in terms of rigor, that score is really cementing that upward trend. It's cementing that story of junior year me is who I'm going to be when I come to your campus. So that can be really valuable for a student. It can also corroborate the level of rigor. So we work with students at some high schools where there might be a certain math class that nobody in that class ever gets above a B. And everybody in the high school knows that that teacher never gives above a B, and the students are stressed about it, even though they know that their counselor is going to write about it. And when admissions officers see that no one in that class got above a B, but they all have 790s on the math section, it does actually support that story. And admissions officers do get that in the weeds with reading files. And then finally, if a student is at a newer high school or a lesser known high school, that score can really help an admissions officer contextualize what these grades mean if they haven't had applicants from there before. And that's true, especially for international students who might be the first person in the history of their school to ever apply to a university. The score can be really valuable. Okay, so now moving on to a few other things to think about. So like I said, many students are pursuing a hybrid approach. That's what we're recommending for them. And that can depend not only on their own profile and the colleges to which they're applying, but the major within the school they're applying for, which might not always be consistent. For example, a student who is a STEM applicant, who wants to be an engineer or who's pre-med, there is a higher expectation of quantitative preparation. Same for business applicants. Colleges do really like to see a score from them and are going to look very closely at the math score. Versus a student who is applying for fine arts, there may not be the same expectations of the score to support their academic performance. So that can be micromanaged by major within the school. What round you're applying in can also make a difference, especially for early decision applicants. That round may be a little bit more forgiving in terms of what score an admissions office would like to see versus the regular pool when they have, say, 30,000 applications for 800 spots, the burden on the test score might be a little bit higher. And then how did students from your high school do? This is a data point that is very valuable because context does matter and it gives a sense of where you fall relative to your peers. And I will say it's not always easy to get. Most of you have younger students, so you might not have access to your school's college planning portal yet, whether it's Naviance or Maya Learning or Score or College Kickstarter or another platform, but eventually you will get access to one. You will see the scattergrams, which are very easy to get sucked into, where you see the GPA and the test score and you compare them at all the schools. And a lot of high schools we are finding do not put test optional data points on those scattergrams. So as you start to have meetings with your school college counselor, I would definitely ask about this if test optional is something that you're considering as a strategy to make sure you can get some of that data and get a sense of how test optional applicants from your high school have done at different schools. That can be really valuable in considering the calculus of this decision. Okay, so again, how are we seeing this play out? Is it real? Are colleges really processing applications this way? Overall, yes, they are. But something that is maddening about the college admissions landscape is they are not all doing the same thing as each other. They never have. They certainly are not now. So we are seeing very different reactions to the test optional shifts, especially this year. I think in the couple years before this, when it felt more related to the pandemic, colleges were maybe a little more on the same page as each other. And now we're starting to see some revelations of preferences in some cases, and otherwise still just a vast black box of we're not going to share anything with you. But a few examples just to show how different it can be based on school. So some colleges this year, in blog posts and podcasts and interviews, especially at some of the more highly selective schools, deans of admissions were saying, there are students out there who should have sent us scores who didn't, who we really wished had sent us scores, who would have benefited from sending their scores, and they didn't send them. And it's because they're overestimating the scores we want. A lot of colleges, their middle 50% of admitted students has gone up, understandably, as a result of test optional, because only students who are high in the range are submitting. But it's gone up so much that the bottom 25% in some of these cases still a score they really would actually like to see. So that's something to keep in mind. And specifically, I cited, there was a great podcast episode with the deans of Dartmouth, MIT, and Bowdoin talking about that together, and they all felt similarly, and they all have very different relationships to testing. Dartmouth is a recent test optional change. MIT, as you may know, went back to requiring testing, and Bowdoin has been test optional for 50 years. So very mixed, but they all felt that way. On the other hand, other schools, especially bigger schools, state schools, especially in the South, have been encouraging students to submit scores, even if they're in the more overtly, and reaching out to them and saying, hey, send us your score. We saw them do that to deferred students this year. Even if it's in the bottom 25%, we want it, send it to us. We've even seen schools say, send it to us and we'll decide if you should be test optional, which is giving them a lot of trust, but we did see that. On the other side, we have also seen schools that are much less likely to say that they want the score and are benefiting from a higher score range and like that because it helps them move up the rankings. So it really depends on the school. And then some, of course, have returned to requiring tests. MIT, as I said, Purdue recently announced that they are going to go back to requiring tests. The University of Tennessee, as of this past fall, required tests again. And there are a number of universities that were never test optional. The University of Florida state system, so UF and Florida State, Georgia state schools, University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, all of those require testing. Georgetown was never test optional. They will require tests and require all of the tests until, I don't know, 2300. So it really varies by school, which again is why students take a hybrid approach, and why overall, when students are entering this process, we really want them to have that choice. We want them to prepare for the exam that's the right fit for them, to do it thoughtfully, to give it the time it deserves so that they can make informed choices about whether test optional is right for them, which it might be, whether test optional is right for them at some schools, which it might be, or whether they're going to send their score everywhere. Okay. There we go. Questions. Emily, we have a question. If you're taking the paper diagnostic, how do you know if the SAT is the right test for you?
That's a great question. So for the current sophomores, as I was saying, we have a little bit of a strange turnaround time here between this paper and this digital exam. So if a student is a current sophomore and is thinking that they want to look ahead to the digital SAT, they're going to have a couple of options. But one of those options is to go ahead and take a digital SAT diagnostic. We are not going to be widely recommending that students start digital SAT diagnostics at this point, just because we are 13 months away from that being an available test to students. And we really don't want to see students burning out on test prep in that amount of time. So one option would be that a student just waits until the fall, wait until September, and then come take a diagnostic. And that will allow you to compare a digital SAT result to a paper SAT or a paper ACT. For the next probably 4 to 5 months, we're still going to be generally having students take paper SAT diagnostics because that's the test that's currently going to be available. But all of these options will be on the table. Digital SAT diagnostics are something that we're going to have at Private Prep. We have a practice test already. We're just kind of figuring out our timeline for when students should really get started. But digital SAT diagnostics comparing to paper ACTs are going to be an option for students in the summer and in the fall. Awesome. Thank you. So any other questions? If anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. While we're waiting to see if there are any additional questions, I'll put our contact information up here. So if you're a current Private Prep client, the best way to get information about starting with test prep is to reach out to your director. They can talk through kind of all of these possibilities and help personalize what Rachel and I spoke about today. If you are new to Private Prep but are interested in having some of these conversations, you can contact So I'll leave that up for everyone.
All right, another question. If your child has straight A's, what would a score on the ACT be to submit or not submit if they don't do well with standardized testing? That's a great question. And I would say it really depends on the colleges to which they are applying, because there are plenty of colleges out there that would love a 26 or 27 from a student with straight A's. And there are others, especially if they are very selective, where I would probably recommend that that student apply test optional if they have straight A's in really hard classes, especially. So that might be the kind of situation where a student ends up with a hybrid list. And typically what might happen in that kind of list is a student might send a score to likely schools, especially if there are still some schools that use the ACT or SAT score to calculate merit aid. So I wouldn't want you to miss out on that, and then not send for some of the more selective schools. Emily, question for you. My daughter's school is suggesting that she focus on either the SAT or the SAT in terms of studying. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I'm actually pretty aligned with the daughter's school here in this case. The ACT and the SAT, again, are not majorly different tests in terms of the content that they're testing. However, it can be complicated for a student to jump back and forth between them because the tests feel different. In the current paper format of the two tests, and this will continue to be true, the ACT is a faster test, and it's a test that really rewards students for thinking quickly and in a straightforward way. Whereas the SAT, students get a little bit more time per question, but it's because the questions are in a lot more depth and require the student to think through things a little bit more conceptually. So there does tend to be a test that feels better for a student and that they can score better on. And so I would agree here that having a student try out both as a full-length diagnostic and choose the one that they're stronger in, and that can be done. We do a diagnostic review with our clients where we look at the two tests, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to decide which one's the better fit. Now, that's not to say that a student can't ever switch between the two tests. We've seen some cases where a student preps for the ACT and they take it maybe 2 real tests, and they're just wondering, I'm feeling like I'm plateauing. Students can make a switch between them, but what we try to avoid is trying to study for both at the same time, taking the February ACT and then the March SAT and then the April ACT just doesn't tend to be the best in terms of a student's process.
Great. Someone wrote in, should our students study for the diagnostics? Yes, similar to what Emily was just saying, because we recommend really focusing on one test at a time. It is absolutely worthwhile to take the diagnostic exams. And Emily mentioned this in the beginning, but we do hear a lot of families say, oh, but I'm taking the PSAT at school, or I'm taking the pre-ACT. We really want them to take the full length exams so that it can be as apples to apples as possible with the real test. And Emily, would you just quickly talk about the ideal timing for students to take diagnostics? When would you say they should do that?
Absolutely. So there is not really one set time, but I would say we have sort of a range of ideal times for taking diagnostics. I think the spring of sophomore year tends to be the earliest we would like students to go in and take a diagnostic. So I would say March, April. Occasionally we shift that a little bit earlier if a student is like thinks that they're going to do really well or has taken a PSAT and scored close to the top of the range. But spring of sophomore year is a good time to start. But students can also start in the summer. They can also start in the fall if they're a student that maybe is concerned that they're going to have a little bit more difficulty testing. It's really never too late for a student to start taking those diagnostic tests. So I would say, start to think about it if your student's a sophomore and they want to have, do some studying over the summer. Probably March and April would be the earliest for a sophomore that we would think about that. And then the nice thing is these diagnostic tests are a baseline. So we are not wanting students to say, oh, I for 8 hours before I took this ACT. We're okay for some for a diagnostic and have never taken an ACT at all before. They just give us a starting point. Then from there, we can choose the test, and then the student can get on their test prep journey.
Great. So the next question, Does applying early, this is a question for me that I'll ask myself. Does applying early change test optional rules in that do schools who care about scores have the same rules across the board, whether a student is applying early decision or not? Great question. The colleges are going to tell you that the rules are the same. You will get the same party line at every single college visit you go to, which is that we have the same standards, no matter which pool you're applying in. That said, the early decision pool, especially if it's early decision, because it's binding, does tend to be a bit more forgiving. So there are circumstances where we do suggest a student send a score in the early decision pool that we might not recommend that they send in the regular decision pool, given how the pool will shift and typically how much more competitive the regular decision pool is. So that's a great question. Someone asked if we offer the SAT and ACT diagnostics outside of school. We do. We have testing centers, and you can also arrange to take them online. So reach out to us and we can do that. And Emily, what are the dates of the SATs and ACTs? Rattle them off. When? A
little bit here, but yes, we do offer diagnostics.
I froze.
I think we might have both just frozen there for a second, but yes. So we do offer at our offices. We have offices in most of our markets. We also offer diagnostics online that students can take at home. And we really like this process, and students will continue to take practice tests throughout this process because we want students to feel what it feels like to take a proctored exam in preparation for the real thing. So in person at offices, also online are options for diagnostic exams.
Great. And someone asked if we do college counseling. We do. We do both college admissions consulting and test prep. We also do subject tutoring and executive functioning tutoring. And one of the great things about being able to work with us is that we will be a team, and Emily's team and my team, talk to each other a lot, which is a really great experience for us, and being able to support families in a team approach.
Awesome. Yep. And I can take, so ACT and SATs are given in terms of dates multiple times throughout every year. They are sort of staggered, but both tests are offered 6 times on standard Saturday test dates throughout the year. The ACT, for example, is given in February, April, June, July, September, October, December. And then the SAT tends to be on alternating months. So students have a lot of opportunities to take these tests. When students get to that point in the process, I will just say, we recommend that students are taking maybe 2 to 4 real tests. They're not going to take all of those tests, but they have lots of opportunities, whether they're starting in the spring of their sophomore year, or if they decide to wait until fall or winter of their junior year. Lots of opportunities throughout the year, in addition to sometimes school districts and schools giving in-school SATs or ACTs. Awesome. And then students studying for diagnostics, no, not needed. A lot of times students for diagnostics are sophomores, they're finishing up their year. They really don't need to be familiar with testing before they begin to take a diagnostic, because it's just giving us that kind of straight baseline of where they're starting. We then build on that. And whether it's a super high diagnostic score, whether it's a lower diagnostic score than where the student wants to be, it's really just giving us data, and it helps us guide and analyze our process for tutoring. Awesome. These were really good questions. Thank you so much, everyone. But I think we can leave it there. But again, our information is all here. We'll be sending out a follow-up email that has the recording to this, and then that's also an email that can be replied to ask any questions. Again, reach out to your director if you're already a current client, and they'll be to talk to you about any more details, and then how to kind of take all of this information and put it into your child's content and make sure that they have a plan going forward that works for them.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.